Hey there friends, my name is Jim and today I'd like to talk about starvation. So for those of you who have been too distracted by the aesthetic of warfare and stories of Reddit veterans going over to join Zelensky's Foreign Legion and getting themselves and their teammates exploded, you may have missed some massive market shifts this week. So Ukraine and Russia make up roughly 30% of global wheat exports, and the last time there was a supply issue with them, even a fraction of this size, it caused a little event in the Middle East known as the Arab Spring. Not enough people were able to get food to feed their families, which led to them protesting, and videos of police brutality came out, and it all kind of snowballed into many of those countries destroying themselves, and some of them have yet to stabilize. Looking at you, Libya. Not only that, but while the Western world decided to make the move to begin sanctioning oil and gas, they seem to have failed to remember that all of our fertilizers are made from petroleum. That's kind of a big deal. When we think that we can control the world with our vast riches, we need to kind of remember that you can't eat gold. Now, before we get started, I'd like to remind you guys that you are who I rely on to get this information out. So if you think this story is important, please click the link to the video and send it to a friend. This may be one of the biggest ramifications of our involvement in the Baltic, and nobody's talking about it, so please help get this out there. Also, if you think what I do is actually valuable, please feel free to check me out on Locals, Patreon, or my site at jimmygms.xyz, linked in the description below. Now let's get into it. So, there are a few things that are foundational to our understanding of these global food supply chains, and unfortunately, these things are the things that our current heads of state have completely overlooked on their mission to make themselves as powerful and rich as possible. This starts with the fact that Russia is this fucking big. Now, while a lot of that area is Siberia and therefore not good for farming, the amount of arable land they have is still the 5th largest in the world, and farmland is not the only thing needed to produce crops. You know, times like these remind me of the primary distinction between the elitists we have when compared to the actual elites of the past. Back in the so-called robber baron era of development, people like Carnegie knew how the supply chain for steel worked, and people like Rockefeller actually ran the railroads. When they heard about a war starting somewhere, or like a famine or some kind of big event happening, they immediately tried to figure out how this would affect their bottom dollar and began strategizing on how best to continue to sell their product without disrupting supply and demand, because they actually felt the pain when something like that happened. Now we have people like Biden, Kamala Harris, two of the most sheltered people in the world with no idea how any of this works. Before Biden decides to do something like stop importing oil from Russia because of a territorial dispute that has dick all to do with us, he doesn't convene a group of internationally recognized economists and war strategists. He doesn't take a moment to consider how the people in America will suffer if gas gets up to $10 a gallon. And he doesn't even think it's his responsibility to come up with a solution to this. Now, instead, our leaders fall ass backwards into the most destructive possible global decision making, and when people start to question whether or not it was wise, he will yell at them.
So I'm sick of this stuff. We have to talk about it because the American people think the reason for inflation is government spending more money. Simply not true.
Of course, this is nothing really new. They've publicly seemed to have been confused about what's raised inflation and things like gas prices prior to the war starting, blaming everybody from OPEC to some nebulous consumer increase in spending since the end of the pandemic.
Gas prices already the highest in U.S. history. The national average, $4.23 a gallon tonight.
I'm going to work like the devil to bring gas prices down.
The significant reason why prices are up is because of COVID affecting the supply chain.
He's going to do everything he can, to reduce the impact on the American people, including the price of gas at the tank.
Gas supply companies are paying less and making a lot more.
He's suggesting that the industry's outsized profits and returns to shareholders are to blame for what he calls an unexplained gap as consumer prices rise.
Take a look at oil prices. That is a consequence of, thus far, the refusal of Russia or the OPEC nations to pump more oil.
And that's because of the supply being withheld by OPEC.
The increase in the anticipated continued increase, which is, I think, what some of your colleagues were asking about, that is a direct result of the invasion of Ukraine.
It's going to go up. Can't do much right now. Russia's responsible.
Realistically, though, if you follow the trend line, the price for gas has risen steadily since Biden got into office, because on day one he signed an executive order ending the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, Keystone wasn't pumping oil, but it was a massive signal to American oil and gas investors to move elsewhere, because there's a big chance that you invest in American production, it'll be randomly shut down at some point in the middle and you'll never recoup your losses. This caused them to go back to investing in OPEC countries or even Russia or Venezuela, whereas during the Trump administration, we had 2 full years of energy independence. Remember when Trump was in office and gas was like 2 something a gallon? Yeah, Trump didn't just accidentally slip into that. He deregulated the oil industry and made U.S. energy a lucrative place to invest in, which led to lower prices. If you don't believe me, here is it from Forbes itself. Are we energy independent? The Energy Information Administration, EIA, tabulated U.S. energy consumption in 2019 and 2020 and determined that for both full years, counting all energy sources, we were energy independent. Even though U.S. energy production declined by 5% in 2020, energy consumption also declined by 3% as the pandemic impacted the economy, so our energy independence was shrinking as the pandemic unfolded. As I noted above, the EIA wrote, annual crude oil production generally decreased between 1970 and 2008. In 2009, the trend reversed and production began to rise, and in 2019, U.S. crude oil production reached a record high of 12.25 million barrels per day. More cost-effective drilling and production techniques helped to drive the production increases, blah, 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 blah. And something I gotta say, it's really ironic how U.S. Democrats seem to have some sort of moral stance against pumping oil in our country, but the better thing to do is arm and fund dictators in third world shitholes to kill brown people and steal the resources from them. It's almost as if they don't really care at all, and it's just virtue signaling for internet points and warm fuzzy feelings. This has been further compounded by the fact that this week Biden decided to stop all U.S. imports of Russian oil. And in response, Russia has decided to end all exports up until December 1st, aside from ones that had their side or remain neutral to be determined by Putin. Now, we could absolutely survive without Russian oil here in America if that's all we were worried about, because we only get about 2% of our crude oil from Russia. So if it was just the problem of, hey, we got enough oil to run our cars and that's not going to affect any other part of the economy, then big whoop, it's not that big deal. It's very hubristic of them if they thought that this would do more damage to Putin than his decision to ban all exports will have on the rest of the world. For starters, like I was just ranting about, gas has gone up by about $1.25 where I live in the span of 2 weeks. This will massively increase inflation on top of what has been the worst year for inflation since 1982, and that's only because they fuck with the numbers. In reality, if you do the math like they did back in World War II, we're actually worse off than we were during World War II, prior to the reconstruction afterwards. I'm sure I haven't been the only one. I haven't been the only one to have a bit of a sticker shock over the last year when buying groceries from Target or Winn-Dixie or even Walmart, and everything that got there was shipped using gas. That means that every single product will feel the pain of a global increase in oil costs, and it doesn't matter how little we personally import, because the market missing all of that Russian crude will cause our costs to rise regardless. The price of oil is a global price. It's not like just because we don't import Russian oil, we're not going to feel that effect. However, the more important thing about Russia not exporting is the least sexy commodity of all time, wheat. Yeah. You might not think of Russia and the Baltics much, but the region, and specifically Ukraine, has long been known as the world's breadbasket. The last time there was a major wheat shortage from this part of the world, everyday Egyptians began to starve. Egypt had always had problems with the corruption, and increased prices of food there led to a revolution, unseating their president and beginning what would come to be known as the Arab Spring. The price per bushel of wheat back then got all the way up to $10.80 and led to one of the bloodiest and most infamous mass protests in modern history. The price per bushel today is $11.06. This is a view of how wheat prices have jumped over the last year, which represents an increase of between 70 to 110%, depending on which part of the chart you're looking at. And if we stretch that chart out to 10 years, we can see what it looks like now versus back during the Arab Spring. Wheat is one of the most fundamental staples of food production because wheat gets ground down into flour, and flour is used for damn near everything, as I'm sure you know. There's a lot of uncertainty about how different countries are going to deal with this, with them needing to make different adjustments based on their consumption. But you don't have to take it from me that there will be a hole in the food supply that's not easily filled for the middle income and poorer countries, which is where famine always strikes. Egypt, the world's biggest importer of wheat, imports 85% from Russia and Ukraine, while Lebanon relies on them for roughly 50%, and they aren't the only ones. The poor people in Yemen, which is a country already torn apart by years-long attacks with weapons supplied by the U.S., by Saudi Arabia, another war crime that we're involved in that nobody seems to care about, they get 40% of its wheat from them. The entirety of the Middle East and huge parts of Western Europe rely on Russia for their food, and being cut off will mean certain starvation for the poorest among them. Worse yet, most of these nations only have enough supply for months at most.
If the situation escalates and the wheat market is halted, we have enough for about a month's worth of wheat stored in mills. But after that, we have no reserves.
With war in Ukraine and Russia, our reserves will drop, and instead of supporting our needs for the next 4 years, it will only be available for 2 or 3 months. The crisis will affect us, and we will suffer from wheat shortages.
Because of the war between Russia and Ukraine, we have fears of a shortage of flour and wheat. But God willing, we will overcome these difficulties.
Of course, there has to be one more huge nail in the coffin for affordable wheat. And of course, it happens to be China. Believe it or not, China is the world's biggest producer of wheat. Usually. It's just that the Chinese people all eat it, so they don't actually export any of it. This year, due to abnormally heavy rain earlier in the season and the planting season, China was unable to plant about a third of its wheat crop, which means that it will be likely to be importing. What country do you think Russia will prioritize sending wheat to? The US, European countries, or China? Really, it doesn't even matter though, because the principle stands the same, just like I was saying with gas earlier. Simply having another market importing will cause the price to spike even higher if demand in China isn't met. Another big deal is sunflower oil. Another boring thing, because Ukraine and Russia make up about 80% of the world's supply of that as well. Now, Ukraine makes up the lion's share at roughly 46%, and Russia fills in the end. And if you haven't noticed, they can't get any of that transport out of the Black Sea because their ports are currently being fought over. Sunflower oil is another one that doesn't sound sexy, but seed oils are in fucking everything. Check anything, some sort of form of vegetable oil is in there, and sunflower oil is one of the biggest. Now, places like India are going to need to purchase palm oil or other forms of vegetable oils, and what will probably happen is the developing world will end up being priced out of oils in foodstuffs as a whole, because taking one big majorly used source of oil out is pretty bad. Get this though. When countries can't get sunflower oil, the best replacement is palm oil, because it's grown in a lot of places. The biggest palm oil producer is Indonesia. And Indonesia just announced a ban on palm oil exporting because they want it for their citizens. Again, I know this is boring stuff, but if you want to understand why people are starving in the streets and shooting you for cans of peaches next year, this is what you need to research. Now, with wheat and oil being struck down to starvation levels, how could it get worse for food markets? Well, not only does this region account for a full 30% of wheat exports, but an even more severe problem could come from our extreme over-reliance on petroleum fertilizers. Because, of course, we get that from Russia. Not only them, though the number one exporter of potash, which is a really important fertilizer ingredient, is Canada. Numbers 2, 3, and 4 are Russia, Belarus, and China, respectively. Belarus is firmly on the side of Russia, as far as I believe they said they're going to be sending in assistance, and China's doing its best to pretend to be a neutral arbiter, but they're clearly on the part of what they're calling the Axis at this point. Our global food supply chain is only kept able to feed the billions of people we have on our planet because of our modern fertilizers, to the point that without them, we would see a die-off that's completely unprecedented in modern human history and probably unprecedented in all of human history, because over this last 100 years, we've used those GMOs and fertilizers and all this stuff that require this global supply chain to keep churning to bring ourselves from about 1 billion people to about 7. So we've got an excess of about 6 billion people all reliant on the global food supply chain. We've come to rely so much on these global food supply chains that we've taken them completely for granted. The powers that be have forgotten just how precarious all these systems are, and they think that they have complete control over them. This will be the move, in my opinion, that shows Western leaders don't actually have the power that we as a collective people think that they do. Biden, for him, is under the delusion that he can do something that'll actually punish Russia, while what they're actually doing is forcing them into the hands of China and emboldening their economy in the long term. Sure, Russia will suffer without the ability to use the global payment systems, things like Facebook, Visa, MasterCard, but this will just force Russians and Chinese people closer together, because they'll be able to wax poetically about how Americans are attempting to destroy them and the whole of the Western powers are coming together to break them down, and China and Russia back to back will fight this off. It's the story of all time. When you give your two enemies, they will combine against you. But they have 1.4 billion people just south of Russia who are more than willing to offset any economic damage NATO can do if it means creating a competing international power structure to rival that of the US and the EU. All I can say, for people like us, for random Twitter anons, frogs, people who don't have the power to change any of this, use this knowledge to your advantage. All this points to 2022-2023 year being a year of extreme famine. Food prices will go up, and now the out-of-control inflation can't be halted simply by increasing interest rates like all the Western governments are planning to do. Basically, the idea was they continue to print money and print money and print money during the pandemic. They spend it all on all their pet projects. They use that as an excuse to get all this money printed, and then they jack up the interest rates to make it so that people are less likely to borrow. Currency kind of settles down, inflation stops. The problem is, you can't stop people from buying food no matter the interest rates. It looks like our leaders have gotten us into a situation where we're on the edge of the biggest famine in modern human history. Now, I'm definitely no financial advisor, and this is not financial advice, YouTube, but I bought some rubles. Do you think Russia's going to cease to exist? Their currency is just going to disappear? Or do you think they will come out of the other side of this with a more independent banking system separate from the West that can withstand this kind of heat? Do you know how to invest in commodities? Now would be the time to look into that, whether or not you're doing with your money is going to help you in the long term. This isn't a Cold War against the USSR where you can just wait for them to collapse. No, they have China this time, and I'm firmly of the belief that it'll be our turn now. Have a great night, guys.